message, cleanse the world, and keep the world for his people.
I absolutely loved this movie. It was as good as I could have possibly hoped it to be. I have been a fan of this series so long, and to see it brought to life so vividly and so faithfully, I honestly was having trouble believing my eyes. For example, I never expected them to include Mapes at all, and my jaw dropped when they had her literally do the scream when Jessica says "Maker." This is a great scene in the book. It communicates both the extent and the limits of Jessica's Bene Gesserit powers. As someone who has read the book, I could see so much of what's going on in her head come through in the scene, but I have no idea if any of it was clear to someone who hasn't read this scene. There are limits to how much an actor can communicate what's going on internally. And that's a good analog for my thoughts on the whole movie. As a fan of the Dune books, it was an incredible experience, but I have no idea how accessible it was to someone who hasn't read the book. Because it was so faithfully adapted, there are a lot less changes to talk about than I thought there would be. But a movie is a different medium and changes are inevitable, and I always find it interesting to see what they changed. There will be no spoilers beyond what was covered in this movie, though I might reference knowledge from other books. I won't spoil anything. There are certain signs in this movie that they might be thinking of adapting more of these books, and since the fourth book is possibly my favorite book of all time, I find that very exciting. One thing to note is that I'll be focusing on story changes. I don't really care if the spaceships, thopters, clothing, or whatever look different. Now, without further ado, and in no particular order, let's go through some of the best, worst, and biggest changes of Dune 2021. Duncan Idaho gets a lot more attention than he does in the book, and I loved it. In the book, he's more of a side character, important to Paul as a teacher and mentor, but spends fairly little time actually on page. There's nothing like this scene where Paul asks Duncan to take him early, or his awesome fighting scenes. His death scene was way more drawn out than in the books, and it was great. I'll be honest, I was a little skeptical of Jason Momoa as Duncan, but he nailed it. I think he was my favorite performance in the movie, just edging out Jessica. He is the action hero the Dune universe deserves. I just wish we could see more of him. Too bad he dies so early. Speaking of action, here's a big one. The way warfare works is totally different. In Dune, the houses fight each other according to the formal rules of Cali, which is a sort of formal feud or vendetta of sanctioned warfare with rules that prevent the deaths of innocent bystanders. In the book, the Sardaukar wear Harkonnen uniforms and infiltrate the city, which leads to mostly hand-to-hand combat. If they were to bomb an entire city like this, there would probably be severe consequences, either from the guild or from other houses. The complexities of lasgun and shield interactions are also never mentioned, and the Sardaukar just shoot a lasgun into this room, knowing that they might cause an atomic explosion if anyone inside had an activated shield. In the Dune universe, shields stop explosives and become a nuclear bomb if hit by a lasgun, so that causes most fighting to be done hand-to-hand, and make this explosive bombing both against the rules and militarily impractical. Anyway, it doesn't really matter since they did this for one simple reason. Explosions look great on screen. To show you how willing I am to be insufferably nitpicky, here's something that really bothered me. Every so often, they would slip into this awkward 21st century dialogue that sounded totally out of place, like here.
Are you good?
Or here.
It's getting close, guys. We better abandon ship now.
This is a small thing, but it really dragged me out of the moment and almost feels carelessly left in. They use so much language directly from the books, these few moments when they slip up stand out obnoxiously. This is something that Game of Thrones struggled with too. You could feel the gears crunch as it would shift from book dialogue to show dialogue. This is something Lord of the Rings did spectacularly well. They used as much of Tolkien's language as they could, and when they added things, they did an incredible job of making it sound like Tolkien. Hopefully this doesn't get worse. The books written by Frank Herbert's son after his death have the same problem of the style not being quite right, and both his son and his son's co-author worked on this movie. Also, I wonder if this inconsistency actually made the acting suffer overall. There are certain times when the more formal language sounded sort of stiff, and I wonder if not having that language be a consistent part of the character made it harder for the actors to sell the formal language scenes. In any case, this inconsistent language was weird as a viewer. Here's a small beginning of a much larger change that I also really didn't like. These palm trees are not part of the Freeman dream. These palm trees are a symbol of power that the Harkonnens wielded and symbolizes that on this planet, water is wealth. The Harkonnens also do stuff like slop water on the ground, washing themselves at the entrance of the estate to show they are so wealthy they can waste water. To the Freeman, water is wealth. The Freemen stockpile water in order to enact a purposeful ecological change to the planet. They do not waste it on trees that symbolize wealth and do nothing to achieve their dream of a water-rich ecosystem on Arrakis. The Baron is very different. Superficially, his suspensors don't work like this at all. Basically, he's too fat to move himself around, so they just help ease some of the work off his legs is all. He doesn't fly around like this. Here they are really playing him up as evil and power-hungry and presenting himself as such. The Baron in the books is gross and scary, but he has a much more subtle sort of menace on the page. He has a veneer of kind fat uncle that he hides his monstrous gluttonous nature underneath. He is good at seducing people with power or other things they desire. I personally don't love this change, but I recognize that the book Baron is a very difficult thing to bring to life on screen. It would probably require a lot more time and subtlety, which they don't have. So I don't begrudge this shortcut to hyper-evil Baron, even though I would have preferred the original, though I wonder if this could cause problems down the line if they ever get to the third book. I still have no idea what this weird spider thing is, though. Also, so far at least, they've cut out a key Harkonnen character, the Baron's favored nephew, Feyd-Rautha. In the books, the Baron's plan is to use his nephew Rabban to squeeze profits from the planet and make the locals hate him, so he can then replace him with his other nephew, Feyd. They could technically still include Feyd in the second part, where he has a much more active role, but I initially thought that they were just going to merge Feyd and Rabban into a single character based on the casting. Could be either. We'll have to see the casting for part 2 before we know, though. Incidentally, Feyd's only appearance in this part of the book was in another cutscene that contributed to a big change. In one of the earliest chapters, the Baron explains to Feyd how they are going to use Yue to bring down the Atreides. So in the book, you know Yue is the traitor the entire time, and so the tension comes from seeing whether he will be found out. Jessica gets very close to unmasking him in the book, but she can tell he hates the Harkonnens and so thinks he can't be the traitor. This is also related to my favorite change. In the book, there is a whole subplot where Thufir thinks Jessica is the traitor, and the Duke plays along to try and smoke out the real traitor. It takes a lot of time, and I was happy to see it cut. The first half of the book can really drag, and I know a lot of people who gave up in this section while reading it, so I think cutting quickly to the betrayal and downfall was a really good change for the movie. However, it does mean that a lot of the political complexities get completely lost. In the book, Arrakeen is a much more vibrant city with different classes of people and powerful characters that have to be watched, replaced, bought, or persuaded to serve Atreides' interests. The Duke hosts a dinner party where we get to see a lot of these characters interact, and Jessica, Paul, and the Duke try and unpack all the different loyalties and competing interests, and we get nothing like that in the movie. But again, this is probably for the best. Although, some of those complexities are important for understanding character motivations. For example, not that we see the Emperor in this movie, but his reasoning for destroying the Atreides is not at all clear. The Duke hints at it here,
Great houses look to us for leadership, and this threatens the Emperor.
but that's just part of the picture. The Emperor has the best military among all the houses, and so the power is balanced between him and his Sardaukar on one side, and the combined armies of all the other houses on the other. But because Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck have been training the Atreides, their forces are starting to get uncomfortably close to Sardaukar levels of skill. This is a massive threat to the Emperor, because it is the beginning of a tip against him in that balance of power. Paul says that what the houses fear most is the Sardaukar picking them off one by one, and the Emperor knows this, so he is taking a huge risk by sending them here, because if the other houses found out, it would lead to all-out war. But from his perspective, having the other houses get armies as good as the Sardaukar is what he fears most, which forces him into the Arrakis affair. Another change I really liked was how they added this vision of Jameis as an instructor in Freeman ways. This is not something that happens in the book, unlike the many visions of Chani. However, it's a great way of communicating that his visions are not completely accurate. The books make it clear that the future is always in motion, and so prophecy is not an all-powerful force. Maybe if he had fought and taken the pistol from someone else and not embarrassed him in this way, he really would have been his instructor. If Paul had been standing on the other side of his mom, maybe it would have been a true vision. It goes a long way to showing the limits of his powers, and they can also use these visions to amplify the impact of Jameis's funeral, if they include that in the next one. I really wish Chani said her line in the vision though. Ask him to tell you about the waters of his homeworld. Come on. I really didn't like that they sort of insinuate Jessica had a son because she pridefully thought she could make the
Kwisatz Haderach.
This is not why. One of the Bene Gesserit powers is that their control over their internal anatomy allows them to decide the sex of their children. This gives the Bene Gesserit an incredible amount of political power in a world where rulers want them for their other powers and need male heirs. It also allowed them to conduct a gene breeding program where they have been carefully trying to create a male with the powers of a Reverend Mother and more powers, sort of a male Bene Gesserit that can see the future and the past. Jessica does want her son to be this, but she had a son because Duke Leto wanted a son, and Jessica loved him. The Emperor also wanted a son, but his Bene Gesserit wife obeyed her masters in the Sisterhood, while Jessica, out of love for Leto, disobeyed them. All they had to do was have her say to Reverend Mother Mohayim that she did it because she loved him, right here. 2 seconds. It really irritated me that they left this out. When I first saw the casting and saw the Kynes gender swap, I was a little unsure. On the one hand, this is a highly patriarchal society, and the Freemen are no exception. Their naives are all men, though their women are no less dangerous. And so I wondered what having a woman leader meant for any changes to Freeman culture in the movie. But there is precedent in the books for the Freeman to follow a woman, and Kynes' position is largely inherited from his father anyway. Even if Kynes' father had had a daughter in the book, then little probably would have changed. As it turned out, they didn't get to any of the cultural impacts it might have had, and Sharon Duncan Brewster did an awesome job. In the book, I hardly feel bad when Kynes dies, but in the movie, even though I knew it was coming, I still hoped she would escape. So far, the gender swap hasn't had anything beyond a superficial impact, and I was so happy at all the stuff they did include. I loved the detail of her awe at Paul fastening his boot slip fashion, and when the worm took the crawler, I started thinking of the prayer to Shai-Hulud in my head, and I almost cried when she started saying it out loud. Those are the kinds of details they didn't need to include, but really hint at the depth of this world, which is all they have time to do, and I'm so glad they understand that. However, there is a lot more to Kynes' character and role in the Freeman that was hinted at more in the book up to this point, but not included in the movie. But we'll just have to wait and see what makes it into the next movie. Here's another change that has the potential to be big, but we'll have to see how it plays out. The ethnicity of Paul and the Freeman. The Dune universe is basically a post-racial society, and ethnicities are, as far as I can remember, never mentioned. The Duke is described as having dark skin that reminds Jessica of olive groves. Paul's skin color is never mentioned. And this is neat because it gives them a lot of freedom with their casting. But there's one potential problem. Out of all the shots in Game of Thrones, this might be the worst one. All these brown slaves reaching for their white savior as the camera soars heroically to the sky is pretty gross. And by far the worst thing about this is that this is a change from the books. Daenerys is not ethnically different from the people of this region, and the slaves are also not all the same ethnicity. So far, the Freemen seem to be mostly brown-skinned. Javier Bardem is Spanish, but I'm worried that if the other Freemen are only cast as brown-skinned, with Paul being white, that we are starting to lean into the same white savior trope that Game of Thrones did. Similarly, the Freemen are not described in the book as brown-skinned. They are coded as Bedouin, but they seem to be ethnically diverse. For example, there are Freemen with blonde hair in the books. In later books, we get confirmation that Paul is indistinguishable from a Freeman. Their only identifying physical feature is their totally all blue eyes with no whites, which is another thing the movie changed, by the way. I think it would be hard to make it as bad as this, but it's something I'm going to keep an eye on in the next one. I want to reiterate that I loved this movie. By far, my most popular video is criticizing Star Wars for over-explaining things, and you sure can't lay that criticism on this movie. I deeply appreciated that they went fast, explained almost nothing, and just expected you to be on your toes to keep up. I never felt coddled, and every piece of exposition felt character-driven instead of shoehorned in. From talking to people and reading comments online, it seems like some people who didn't read the books did get lost, but there were also many who didn't. I think Hollywood has conditioned us to expect being babied, that everything will be obvious even if we aren't paying attention. I think that people who were excited, interested, and willing to try and catch every detail were well rewarded whether they were a book reader or no. I wish more movies were like that. There are always things that could be better, but I can totally accept changes that are done for good reasons. It's possible they'll screw it up eventually and it'll seem obvious in retrospect, but for now I am happy and hopeful. If there was a change you loved, hated, or thought was huge that I didn't mention, go ahead and let me know in the comments. If you thought a change I thought was good was bad or vice versa, I'd love to know why. And please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like these. Thanks for listening to this random nerd ramble. When part 2 comes out, I'll probably do some more serious analysis of the two as a whole like I did for The Witcher, Game of Thrones, and Lord of the Rings, but in the meantime I hope you enjoyed this more informal, quick style of video. See you next time.